Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. We are back on the creative world and I've done some building and I wanted to kind of do, I guess, a little bit of a lesson of what I've learnt on how to make gradients. So I've learnt a couple things as of recently, or just kind of experimented quite a lot. And I've done a few things here that I kind of want to explain, just to give you a bit of a gist on how gradients work. Here we have 3 different sets of gradients. Now, they all go from one colour to another, but they have all got different traits, and how you can use them in builds is very varied. So I'll explain a little bit on how each one of them is different and what you can kind of use them for. So this one here is a gradient from one colour to another. It has multiple colour stops, so it goes from yellow to green to blue and then purple. So if you want to do a gradient with multiple colour stops like this, the first thing you want to start with is just by spacing out the different colours you want. So in this case, when I made this, I wanted yellow, green and purple. So I spaced them out, put the yellow on one end, green in the middle and then purple on the other. And then I just found blocks that kind of went between each. These you kind of have to play with mini gradients in between the colour stops. So in this case, yellow to green, I had to make a mini gradient and just focus on this section. So I chose a little bit of yellow wool, yellow concrete, and then the lime glazed terracotta just to bring a little bit of the yellow in. Now from a close up, it doesn't look super great, but as you go further out, the colour kind of blends a lot together, and that's how gradients kind of work. Now here we have the small gradient in between the lime concrete and the magenta. This one was less of a small gradient and more of a big gradient in the terms that it has multiple different kind of, not stops, but I had to do a lot of blocking to kind of make it go together. So one of the tricks I used for this gradient specifically was I went through saturation. So what that means is the brightest colour block, or the one you can see the most colour on, is the most saturated. Something that's a little bit more greyed out or whited out is less saturated. So I went from this very heavily saturated lime concrete, we kind of dulled it down with a bit of bamboo. It still brought some of the colours of the lime in, but in a lot more of a muted format. Then to green concrete as it's starting, or green concrete powder, and it's starting to bring back that colour. And then green terracotta kind of takes it away just a little bit, and then we just work from that. So by desaturating, we're able to move from one colour to another by going from this kind of grey, not very nice looking colour in the middle. Now saturation, of course, is another way you can use gradients. That's what I've done here. So a gradient from a red concrete to white terracotta, or any white block really, you can continue this going for a while. This gradient here is playing with saturation. So this is kind of a more fleshed out version of that I was talking about. It goes from a very bright red concrete to the white terracotta. And it does that by going from red concrete powder, mangrove, netherrack, terracotta and wax exposed. Now this was able to draw out the colour from the red. So this red is quite bright. As we move to the red concrete powder, it kind of gives it more of a muted, I guess, white infused look into it, but it's still close enough in colour that it doesn't look too bad. Now we move over to the mangrove planks. It could be a better transition between these two, but we are limited with the blocks that we have in Minecraft. But with this, it still brought a bit of a grey tone. It's definitely very different of a colour to the red here, but it's still muted enough that you can use it as a desaturating colour. This goes into the netherrack, which is a little bit more desaturated. It's got less of that orange tinge in it, that warmer glow. This goes a bit cooler. Then we go to some terracotta, which has some cool undertones. Again, this isn't as good of a split as I'd like, but again, we are limited with blocks in Minecraft. And then it goes to the wax exposed and the white terracotta. So this kind of draws out, so this is able to draw out some of the saturation from the red, and still able to put it into a white terracotta. And again, you can just keep going through the colour and wouldn't need much more, just a couple more blocks to keep it all together. But the desaturation gradient is used quite a lot in builds that I've seen. It's one of the most common. It's mostly because people like to go from a bright colour either at the top of the build, and they just want to mute it down just a little bit, which is completely fair. I've used this gradient quite a lot, probably a lot more than I've used this gradient. So here this may not quite look like a gradient like the ones we've seen before. That's only because I haven't really meshed in the colours, and that's just because I had limited space. But I have this here for the idea. This is a recurring gradient, so it goes from the pink terracotta, this stripped crimson hyphae, magenta concrete, and then shulker boxes. Now, that is a gradient on its own, just these 4 blocks. Then it repeats again and once more, so it's a 3 repeating gradient. This is used quite a lot in builds, and I think that I've used this a fair amount in some of my builds, at least repeated it twice maybe. It's not as common of a gradient as compared to these 2, but people still use it, whether intentionally or not quite. These gradients are usually best used on big builds because, again, you need a lot of space to make sure you can meld each one in each other, like we've done with these ones. Because right now this one just looks like a striped gradient pattern, which it's still a gradient, just not as melded in as the other ones. Now, gradients are really fun to use in builds. I've used them quite a lot, and I wanted to do a bit of an example here. Not the greatest example, I kinda just threw this together very quickly, but it'll get the point across that I'm trying to get. I've used 2 gradients in this one. I've used a saturation gradient, which has gone from the birch into the mushroom stem, and I have used a colour gradient, which goes from the green into the cyan. Now, I wanted to try something where I could put 2 of these gradients together in the builds, and I think this looks really cool. I do like it, even though it was a quick thing, still do like it. I've melded these in, there's not much on the back or anything like that, I've just done a very simple house to get the point across. Now, this desaturated gradient and the colourful gradient's gone together. It also just represents the comparison of the colours, so the bit of the contrast with the more muted tones with the brighter colourful tones, with the more muted colours and the more saturated colours. Now, this is a very small build, but I was still able to incorporate a gradient, and it would have been a lot less impressive. I don't want to use the word impressive because this is a very simple build, but it would be a lot less impressive if it was just 1 block. If I did this entire house just with birch, it would not give the same effect that it does. This kind of draws the eye in a little bit, it gives a bit of interest to the walls without over texturing it. And the same goes for this tower kind of next to it. If this was just lime terracotta and birch, yep, they're lovely colours, they work very well together, but again, it doesn't have that same level of interest that a gradient does. Again, this isn't the most perfect gradient, I didn't have a lot of space, and the melon does kind of stand out, but from afar, you can see that they do go well together, because it kind of melts in from afar. The patterns don't really mean as much, and the colours itself, they kind of draw you in. I won't lie to you, making gradients is a little bit hard. I do have a few tools that I am able to use that can help me make these gradients or pick out the blocks that I need for each one. I've got a rendered world of like a 3D color wheel, which I'm able to kind of go in a diagonal motion into each color I want. Now, there's quite a few places that have these downloads, so I don't have a specific one, I kind of go through the ones that I have. Otherwise, if you don't have that, that's totally fine. These gradients I made without using that color wheel. You kind of just have to look at the different blocks. What I find helpful, and what I also have in a separate world, is all of the blocks laid out in color order. And I've tried to gradient them from most saturated to the least saturated, just so it can help me in the future if I need some gradients. Oh, we've lost entities. Let's go a little bit lower. But yeah, gradients can be incredibly fun, and they definitely help bring a build together, or make it pop. It adds a level of interest to builds that you wouldn't otherwise have with texturing. With that being said though, it does also indirectly texture. It's not really the main point of it, but you know, it's blocks, it's Minecraft, we've got so many different ones. But yeah, that's probably all I have to say with gradients. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments and I'll do my best to answer them. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope that you learnt something, or at the very least enjoyed this video. I'll see you in the next one. Bye!